adult men in this world lead some of the scariest statistics that are out there. Infidelity, internet pornography, substance abuse, and suicide. And if you think about just those four, it is a male's attempt to try to numb out or avoid whatever it is that he's feeling. If I were going to give the Cliff Notes version of what I think emotional strength is, it would be this.
This weekend, watching you with our grandsons, you walk in and light up a boy's life. You understand boys like I've never seen. And so I've got one question for you, because we're going to talk about raising boys today, emotionally healthy boys. What would you say is the most important advice you could give a mom or a dad?
I mean, the first thought, this is crazy, that comes to my mind is embrace the physical chaos. That's the first thing. It feels like chaos with little boys because they just don't sit very often, and they're physical and they're loud. And so as a mom, if you're trying to get a house that's quiet and in order, you're going to be super frustrated because it's pretty chaotic with little boys in a good way, and it can be really draining physically. Yeah,
after spending a weekend with 3 grandsons and a granddaughter, my head is still banging around in my head. It's like my skull is like, it's just like the whole weekend was awesome, but it was chaotic.
Yeah.
But we've got the expert in the studio. You're not a boy mom, you're a boy dad and a father of a daughter as well. But David Thomas, first time ever, I think, on Family Life.
I'm so grateful to be here with the two of you. I can't thank you enough for this invitation. And I'm going to say, I'm not married to your amazing wife, but I will say I get everything you're saying. From the time we've spent together, it makes sense to me why you would have said what you just said. And that's been my experience so far with you.
David!
A really intentional mother of boys. And it's been fun to hear you tell stories.
You're so nice. That means a lot. Thank you.
You can tell already you're a counselor. You can just tell the way
He's empathetic.
You have been encouraging to us since 2 hours ago when we sat down at lunch. And I know you directed. Tell our listeners what you do sort of every single day of your life, and for how many years?
25 years
25 years.
Yes. I have been the director of family counseling at an amazing place in Nashville, Tennessee called Daystar Counseling Ministries for the last 25 years. And I work with an incredible team, the majority of whom are human, but we have 5 therapy dogs on staff. So I work with great canines and humans. And the whole focus for us is the pediatric population. So we work just with kids, adolescents, and families. That's our whole focus. And I have long said and always believed, like, if you go to work every day and you get to hang out with kids and dogs, like, what a great gig. I have a really good day job. And out of that work, I have written some books and had some incredible opportunities just to travel around the country and talk about different aspects of parenting, and super grateful those opportunities led me to be with the two of you today and sharing conversation. So thank you for having me.
The book we're going to talk about today, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys, Tools Your Son Can Build On for Life. I got to tell you, David, when I picked this up, and again, I'm a boy dad. You know, I wish I'd had daughters. We didn't have any, and now we have daughter-in-laws and granddaughters, which is awesome and amazing.
And let's just let our listeners know that David had twin boys.
I did. We had a shocking journey in that my firstborn, as you shared, was a girl. And then we went to our ultrasound for our second pregnancy. We got pregnant a year later, and we were incredibly grateful and went for the ultrasound, as you do, and walked in the door and said to the technician, okay, we're really old school. We don't want to know what we're having. We didn't know my daughter was a girl till the day she was born. So make a note in the chart, but don't tell us. And you all, I can still remember where I was standing in that room as the technician looked up and she said, I see 2 heads. And I remember thinking, why are you smiling if the baby has 2 heads? Like, nothing about that looked or sounded right to me. I was genuinely that shocked. We have no history of multiples. My wife had not gained extra weight. Her counts weren't different. Here we are at the ultrasound midway through, finding this out for the first time and knowing that multiples always come early. So I said to the technician at that point, okay, actually change of plans. We do need to know, since we're so far behind. I'm going to lay down next to my wife and then you tell us what we're having.
Did you?
Yes, I laid down on the bed next to her in the middle of this ultrasound. And she said, 2 boys. We are still recovering from that news 20 years later. So father of a daughter and twin sons who I don't know if the two of you would say this has been true in your life, but I would sure for me. Like, those three human beings have been the greatest teachers of my life. Like, I've had some incredible teachers and mentors in my life that I'm thankful for, but I have learned more from being a student of those three people than I have in any other relationship.
Isn't that one Dan Allender's book?
Yes, How Children Raise Parents.
Yeah.
I love that book.
Yeah, Dan's he was on the speaker team with FamilyLife Weekend Remember. He's just amazing.
I think, though, what you said, David, is true. I used to think, I can't wait that God has chosen me to be their parents because I'm going to instill this knowledge and this wealth of spiritual maturity to my children. And then I got along the road and I thought, oh, this isn't about my kids changing them as much as this whole process is changing me. It's making me see my flaws. It's making me see my weaknesses. It's making me depend on God. And so having boys and having had a girl first, were they different?
Oh my goodness, were they different? And not even just having a girl, but a firstborn girl. And that is not to say that every firstborn girl meets the criteria of firstborn, but it is to say a lot do, which is to mean my daughter, like a lot of firstborn girls, she's conscientious. She's a rule follower. I could run down a long list of things that are true about her that stayed true, that were not as true. In fact, maybe my best example of this would be when she was a senior in high school and she was in the middle of applying for scholarships to college, applying for scholarships. She would come home repeatedly and say things to my wife and I like, hey, I just want to let you both know that I applied for this scholarship today. I'll hear back in 2 weeks. Well, we didn't even know that scholarship existed. We certainly didn't know the deadlines. She applied to more colleges than I knew. Like, we sat down with her college counselor and I was like, oh, I actually wasn't aware she'd applied to that school as well, because she was so on top of things, on her game, had a spreadsheet, all those things. And I remember looking at my wife at one point and just saying, let's just enjoy this, okay? Because it will not go down the same way next time. We may drag those two through the process. And my sons are amazing, and they brought their incredible strengths to that process, but it looked different, as you both know. It looks vastly different. Their strengths are different, and they were maybe even greater because of her firstbornness, I'll make up that word, that has made the entire journey look different. The other thing we laugh about is we were given one of those kits at a baby shower when my daughter was born, where you plug in the sockets and you lock the cabinet shut. And we moved in that process, and we somehow forgot to put all those things up in the kitchen and in the socket, in the outlets. And we found it like a year later. And I said to my wife, oh my goodness, we never even used this. How embarrassing. But we didn't need it. She would find things on the floor and bring it to us. They would find things on the floor and put it in their mouth or up their nose, So we couldn't lock down enough of the kitchen cabinets with those boys. And my daughter, just the way she operated in the world, it was such a different experience. So it was such a learning curve, not only to jump from boys to girls, but obviously 1 to 3.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, my daughter was not 2 when my sons were born. So we had 3 children under 3. We had 3 in diapers. I was driving a Nissan Sentra. My wife was driving a Toyota Camry. We didn't even own a car big enough to put 3 car seats in. People would just come by our house and drop off diapers on the front porch and say, bless you. We hope this is helpful in some way, because we were overwhelmed with parenting 3 children under the age of 2.
Were you a therapist at that time?
I was.
And so you had tools going in.
In my head, I had those tools. Every therapist who's transparent and honest would say to you, all of what you know, and my wife's a teacher, she'd say the same, like all of what works with other kids in terms of our vocations does not always work with your own. You get humbled in a remarkable way to learn that this book knowledge, this thing I'm communicating to parents doesn't always work exactly the way I'd like it to work in my own home. And so it's part of where they've been these great teachers of humbling me, and I think even allowing me, hopefully over the course of my work, to be present with parents in a different way. Because I understand the reality that the 3 of us know that you can do so many of the right things and you can read all the right books and listen to the right podcast, and things just be really hard and things not go as planned. And knowing that God is creating opportunity, as you beautifully said, for our growth, for our transformation as much as for our kids.
Talk about, as a therapist and as a dad, the differences between a daughter and a son. And I know they're unique to so there's generalities that don't cross over. And you know that better than anybody. But there are differences.
There are.
Ann just mentioned even the physicality. She mentioned to you at lunch that we had 12 grand. I
have a sister and 2 brothers, and all of us had boys. So my parents had 12 grandsons.
So when we would get together,
chaos.
It was.
To use your word.
Yes.
Yeah, beyond. Things flying, and you had to wear a helmet to walk through the family room. Some nephews it was crazy. And I'm not saying daughters don't do that as well, but there are differences. And you wrote about raising emotionally strong boys. So I want to get there in a second. Why emotionally strong? Because a lot of people would think just raise strong boys. But talk a little bit about differences.
Well, I think one is the very thing you're pointing to, which is just so wise to highlight on the front side of just their energy is different. We know that early on, girls have advanced abilities to regulate themselves differently than boys. And it's why, to the great point you made a little bit earlier, they have more physicality to who they are as people in this world and even to their emotional experience. That's something I talk about in the book, that research would tell us that toddler-age boys are more prone to, in a classroom, biting, hitting, kicking, screaming, throwing. It's that need for a release that exists in him that is different for a lot of girls. It's why a lot of adolescent boys are prone to punching holes in drywall. I don't hear that story about girls as often. It's not to say it can't happen, but it is to say that energy, that physicality, that intensity is something that we have to work to create. In the book, I call it healthy outward movement. Otherwise, it will come out, but it may not be healthy. Or boys will turn inward on themselves. And neither of those is a helpful, healthy direction. So to your great question, I think it starts with just understanding their energy and then kind of placing that in the context of their emotionality. And the other thing that I would say is, pediatricians would report that at 16 to 18-month well visits, most girls are saying around 100 words. Most boys are saying around 30. So if her general vocabulary is larger, it makes sense that her emotional vocabulary would be larger as well. So we're going to have to labor longer with boys to help them develop a more full, expansive emotional vocabulary. So I love that you asked that question right out of the gate, because it simply means we always want to be thinking about these unique, God-given strengths that exist that make their hardwiring different. Or we could simply miss a lot of opportunities. We could simply place expectations on our sons that aren't helpful for them. So can I throw out one last one?
Sure.
Developmental theorists would say most girls finish adolescence somewhere around 19 to 20. And they would say for boys, it's 22 to 25.
Jeez.
That's significant.
You know why Ann's laughing right now? Because she married me at 22. I didn't know that laugh was like, I married an adolescent.
Absolutely.
And it was sort of like I was not mature yet.
I'm laughing, though, because we had one of our sons say that I don't think I was emotionally mature until I was 25. Like, for him to say that now as a 30-some-year-old, he's like, I don't think I even knew who I was. And it felt like, he said, my wife knew exactly who she was and how to respond emotionally.
Yes, she did. And I love his transparency. And I think a lot of adult males can't say that. And your reality was my reality. I was 24 when we got engaged, 25 when I got married. And I remember my wife came to a class I teach on boy development at one point, and I shared that reality that I just shared. And on the drive home, I'm like, sweetheart, you married an adolescent. She said, I know. It's no surprise to her.
They knew long before we did.
Long before we did. Absolutely. And so I think if we are embracing that kind of wisdom and knowing that to be true, that God designed us to finish out adolescence in different times, then it allows us to accurately place the finish line at 25 for boys. Now, he might get there a little bit earlier, but somewhere in that 22 to 25 space, as opposed to, I think we launch boys out into the world sometimes around 17, 18, 19, saying, go be a grown-up. And he could have a good 8 years of adolescence left. And so It's where, in some previous work I've written on boys, I talk about how intentional I want to encourage parents to be with the summers of a boy's college years. Like, I think there's so much learning that happens in the classroom between 18 and 22, but I think the summers of those years, I want boys working. I want them doing internships and practicums and missions experiences where there is so much growth and learning happening to honor their development and all of the growth that still needs to be taking place in that time that I think is as pivotal as whatever kind of learning is happening in the classroom as well.
That's really wise. And you want them doing those kind of things in the summer versus what? Nothing?
Nothing, which is where I think a lot of boys, sadly, this day and age more than ever are going to land. I have this section in the new book about how often I sit with boys who are like, I just want a chill summer.
Yeah.
And if I drill down on that, I know what that always means. Like, I don't want a bedtime. I don't want a wake time. I don't want any expectations. I don't want any chores. I don't want a summer job. I don't want a schedule. I want unlimited screen time. Like, there's a lot of ways that I think boys would define a chill summer.
Yeah.
Because they aren't self-actualized enough to structure that time well for themselves. They need us to help them structure it. And again, honoring development, my sons need that differently than my daughter needed that. They're 20, and where she was at 20 looked very different because I understand development than where they are right now. And so all of the ways that I think that might help us think. For example, I sit with a lot of families who would say to me, David, I think my son might benefit from a gap year. I think it could be helpful for him to do some work for a year before he goes to college and have a better understanding of the value of money, a better understanding of the value of education, so many things. And that's not a right decision for every boy, but I'm not surprised when it's a right decision for more boys than girls. Mm-hmm. I don't sit with as many parents of girls who would see evidence. That's not to say girls don't benefit from that. There are some who do. But again, if we are really looking at all of what's true about growth and development and these differences we're discussing, I think it would mean we would make some different decisions on behalf of the amazing sons that we love to honor development.
Yeah, well, let's talk emotionally strong because
I'd love to.
I mean, even in your title, as I picked up your book, I'm like, what does that look like? How does that work? I remember I've shared this here before. I had 3 sons. Steve, who started the church, we started church together, had 3 daughters.
I can't believe you're sharing this.
Oh, this is fascinating. They were
fascinating or bad?
Well, we'll see. And maybe it'll get edited out. But and Steve knows this story. But they were visiting, and we're jumping in our minivan. And I remember 2 of their daughters, probably middle school age. Would you say?
They're elementary for sure.
Elementary, like 10, 11 years old, probably 9, 10, 11. They start talking about who wants to sit in the captain's seats behind me. I'm in the driver's seat getting ready to drive out of our driveway. And they're arguing about, I want the seat. No, I want the seat. And they just keep going back and forth. And there's this conversation going on that I'm sitting there like I want to get going. And I got frustrated. And I'm embarrassed to say this. I literally turned around, David. I go, just punch her in the arm and take the seat. Because I had never in my life heard 2 boys communicate. They just pushed each other out of the way and grabbed the seat, and that's how life went.
This is why God gave us sons and not daughters.
Well, there's 2 questions there. One is, there's a sense that they were more emotionally healthy than boys were at that time. But, and this is I'm setting you up for a later question. Here's a dad who's not emotionally healthy. How is an immature, emotionally unhealthy dad going to raise emotionally healthy boys or daughters? We'll save that one. But talk about this. What do you mean by emotionally strong? Help us as parents understand. That's what we're trying to do. So what's that look like?
I love to, and I can't wait to unpack that other question because I think there is a lot to be said in that space. So I'm glad you raised it. If I were going to give the Cliff Notes version of what I think emotional strength is, it would be this. I think it's a boy's ability, it's a male's ability to name and navigate his experience. So to understand what I'm feeling and what to do with it. And as simple as that sounds, the 3 of us know we're living in a world where I would argue the higher percentage of males don't know how to name and navigate their experience.
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
When you said that, I'm like, most men, even now, 40, 50, 60 years old, I think it's really different. I'm not saying I know if women can or not, but I know as a guy, that's not easy.
It's not. And I think it's a part of why adult men in this world lead some of the scariest statistics that are out there. We as males lead the stats for infidelity, internet pornography, substance abuse, and suicide. And if you think about just those four, the common denominator being it is a male's attempt to try to numb out or avoid whatever it is that he's feeling. I can't name it. I can't navigate it, so I want to figure out how to shut it down in some way. And it's why, interestingly enough, the stats are higher for girls, adolescent females, and adult women to struggle with anxiety and depression, and yet more males die by suicide. And it's connected to that reality of we don't know how to recognize the struggle and we don't know how to ask well for help. I came across this fascinating data as I was doing the research for this book, even on the number of women who go every year, adult women who go every year for their well visit with their doctor versus men. It's like we just don't attend to our health, our physical health, our emotional health, often our spiritual health. We don't know how to ask for help when we're struggling in any of those categories, whereas you as women, generally speaking, do. And even the way you do relationship. I have a whole section in the book on the strength of connection. The way you build relationships, the ways you are transparent often in relationship. And again, hear me say there are women who don't know how to do that well, and there are men who do. But generally speaking, I come across more men who don't. You know, in 25 years of doing this work, I commonly sit with families, unfortunately, who are in the middle of one of those categories I named, husbands who've been unfaithful in their marriage, husbands who are in the throes of addiction. And I've, for over 2 decades, sat in the residual of what that looks like on marriages and on kids. And so at some point, this book felt connected to, that old quote, Desmond Tutu said, at some point we've got to just stop fishing people out of the river and we need to go upstream and figure out why they're falling in. And that for me was really the passion of this book. Like I want to, on my watch, just say that I knew to do everything I could possibly think to do to be a preventionist in this work. I spent a lot of my days as an interventionist, helping families on the other side of these struggles. And it's like, okay, how much more could I be talking about what we could be doing with boys on the front side of development and be doing with adolescent boys in the middle of development and be doing with adult men even farther down the road in development to be developing in these ways to change those statistics. And so I laugh about this. A mom I met a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a workbook for elementary age boys to go with this book, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys, and it's called Strong and Smart. And the mom said to me, she said, David, I bought your workbook for my 7-year-old son, but I'm mostly using it with my 37-year-old husband. And I'm like, and that's fair. That is fair. You use it with whatever age male is in your household. Because the thing that I say in the front of the book, and that I want folks to hear me say so strongly right now, is that it's never too late. It's never too late. It turns out you can teach an old dog new tricks. It turns out we can learn new things. And I have another 7-year-old boy who's doing the workbook with his grandfather. And when he told me that story, you all almost wept. Like the thought of a little 7-year-old boy doing this with his grandfather in his 60s and that they're learning these things together, it overwhelms me. It overwhelms me on so many levels. One, I think about what that grandfather's last seasons of marriage might look like differently if he could name and navigate his experience. Two, the gift of this little boy getting to sit front row to one of the adult men he trusts the most in this world doing this work in front of him. I just think that's what I hope can happen for so many dads, is that they can allow the boys they love to be sitting front row and watching what it looks like to learn new skills and how that impacts relationships. Here's
something I want your wisdom on, because you sit every day with families and kids, and Ann and I get married, and then I become a dad, and I never had a dad. He walked out when I was 7, so I knew I was deficient in some ways, like, wow, I didn't have a dad, I'm not sure what to do, but I thought I was pretty secure emotionally, and it's probably because I succeeded in different things in life and thought, oh, I'm a college quarterback and blah, blah, blah. I was very deficient.
Now I'm thinking back on our conversations when we first got married, and we were young. I was 19, Dave's 22, but I can remember asking you, what do you feel? What are you feeling about all this? And Dave would often say, I have no idea. I have no idea.
And she would say, yes, you do. You just don't want to tell me. And so we get in fights. And I honestly didn't know. So let's talk about emotionally unhealthy, could be men or women.
Yes.
But we're adults now, and we have responsibilities to maybe be a parent. How are we going to raise an emotionally strong son if we're not emotionally strong ourselves?
It's a great question. And
you're the one to answer it, because we're not going to.
Well, to your great question, I want to say this. I have a friend in Nashville who started a treatment center for professional men. So the entire population would be adult men who are doctors, attorneys, CEOs, pastors, men in leadership, men who have likely been highly successful vocationally and have found themselves in the throes of addiction of some kind. And on the first day in arriving, they do group together, and he will put a feelings chart in the center of the space and ask every man that question, what are you feeling about being here? And he said, David, you have no idea how many adult men. These are Harvard-educated, Yale-educated, Duke-educated men, again, who've been highly successful vocationally, who cannot answer the question. Mm-hmm. And the answers are even in the floor, but they just don't know. That connection between the head and the heart is not something I believe men were trained to understand, particularly men of certain generations. And my grandfather is a perfect example. You know, my grandfather was wildly successful in the work he did as a builder. My grandfather fought in the war. I am a recipient of the freedom my grandfather fought to bring to me as an adult in this moment in time. And he came home from the war having seen friends who died in front of him. Not just friends who were lost in front of him. He saw atrocities that most soldiers have seen that are beyond anything I will ever see in my lifetime, likely. And he came home and was to go right back to work at that point. There weren't resources in place. There wasn't support in place. There wasn't an invitation to say, you have witnessed trauma. And there needs to be a space where you can talk about that and figure out what it looks like to live forward in light of that and not carry it. And so I think it is why there are so many men of that generation in particular who lived in pain and as a result caused pain. I think it's part of the wisdom of that age-old saying of hurt people hurt people. Mm. And I talk about in this book that males who are in pain often cause pain. I talk about how internal pain has an external presentation of some kind, which is why I think adult men lead the stats for substance abuse. And so to the degree that we don't learn to name and navigate, and you said something so important that I wanted to go back to. Well, let me finish that statement by saying this. To the degree that we don't learn to name and navigate, it will show up in some way. I think about the wisdom of that passage, that says, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Like it will come out in some way.
David, say real quick, when you say name what? What are you referring to?
So I think name the feeling, name the experience. For those men sitting in that circlet group, to be able to name, I feel terrified that I'm in a treatment center right now, that I may have just wrecked my marriage, that I may have just lost my job, whatever it may be, that they could not articulate how they were feeling about where they were and what had happened that brought them there. And so I think that's the naming part, that my grandfather wasn't invited to name the experience of losing friends and seeing them die in brutal ways. So as I think about that and the importance of it and all the ways when we can't name that it presents, one of the things that you said that I wanted to go back to that I talk about in the book that's lesser known is that I think overachieving is a way of numbing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we talk enough about that. I mean, we talk about the obvious of substance abuse and the obvious of addiction and the obvious of infidelity, but we don't talk about overachieving. And I think that's not just true for us as men, but also for women. I think about the different ways it presents. I was talking with a mom just this past week about how, with anxiety with girls, often the more out of control they feel internally, they will work to try to control something externally, people, outcomes, situations, experiences. And as I was talking that through, this mom said to me, David, I'm thinking back to being in college myself and that the majority of girls in my sorority had an eating disorder. And I think about it now, what we didn't know then, what we know now, and my guess would be a lot of them had anxiety that they were trying to manage through food. So internal pain always has an external presentation. And to the degree that we can't name and navigate that, it's going to come out sideways in some ways.
Now,
and it could be overachieving. It could be an eating disorder. It could be addiction.
Yeah, mine was definitely the overachieving, and I couldn't see it. And that's my question. How do you help a guy? And again, we could talk about women too, but I'm thinking of a guy, a husband, a dad, who doesn't see it. And then when his wife, I love to hear what Ann thinks, because she could see it in me and would point it out. And often the guy will say, I'm good. I don't need to go to a counselor. We don't need counseling. I don't need counseling. I'm good. Just because I can't name a feeling right now doesn't mean I'm not in touch with my emotions, when actually it does. But he can't see it. So she's stuck trying to encourage him. Like, let's go to a marriage conference together this weekend. No, we're good. I don't need it. She's dying over there. And maybe his kids are. He doesn't see that he's not emotionally strong. How do you help a guy like that get help?
And Dave, I would add, it's not just that you can't name a feeling, because most wives are like, if that was the only problem, I wouldn't be that upset. But when it comes out in other ways, in a pornography addiction, in anger.
Yes.
Anger is a big one. That's when, as a wife, and especially with boys, we don't know how to navigate that.
Yes. And I think it does show up that way for a lot of adult men. And I will hear wives speak to that being the primary evidence of when he's just in the normal day-to-day parenting, the discipline has too much intensity. His words are fueled with so much anger. And again, internal pain, external presentation of some kind. And I would say, to your great question, I think it really starts with the foundational acknowledgement that we are made as emotional beings, every one of us. And I talk a lot in the beginning of the book. I have a chapter on foundation and identity and anchoring boys to an accurate definition of what it means to be a man in this world, which we should never be defining outside of the person of Christ, just who he was. And, if we think about his human experience, we're told throughout Scripture, there's all kinds of evidence of where he felt the different emotions that we feel throughout his life here on earth. And that Jesus, though he was a man who was mocked, abused, abandoned, crucified, all the worst of human experiences, that he didn't go off the rails. Like he was able to deal with the circumstances of his life on earth with humility, with civility, with strength, with emotional strength, all these things that I talk so much about. So I think it starts there of just acknowledging we're made as emotional beings. And so therefore our job is to learn to name and navigate that. And then
would you say that then to like your little boys? Would you teach them that?
I would.
And you probably do that in your practice.
Absolutely. I think it needs to start there with boys. And then this may feel a little surprising for parents listening to hear, but please stay with me. With adolescent boys, I want to go ahead and share those scary statistics we talked about on the front side of our conversation. In fact, I have some stats on page 73 of this book that I encourage parents to read to adolescent boys. Like, I think boys need to go into adolescence understanding, hey, here's the vulnerabilities for males in this world.
Will you read those to us?
I would be glad to, absolutely. And so we're going to go back to some of these realities that we briefly previewed in episode 1 that I think are my starting point. I have a whole section on anxiety and depression, and I talk about, let me back that up. I have a chapter on anxiety and depression, and within that I talk about how the American Journal of Men's Health says that depression and suicide are ranked as a leading cause of death among men. 6 million men are impacted by depression in the United States every single year. And you all, this next stat was one of the hardest statistics that I put in the book, but listen to this. Globally, on average, so around the globe, 1 man dies by suicide every minute of every day. And just before flying here, I heard about another college young man who had committed suicide. It's the third one I've heard about this month, who died by suicide in his dorm room. Here's some more stats. Men are often reluctant to openly discuss their health or how they feel about the impact of significant life events. Men are more reluctant to take action when they don't feel physically or mentally well. and men engage in more risky activities that are harmful to their health. These behaviors are strongly linked to traditional masculinity. Men often feel pressure to appear strong and stoic. They resist support and help, and they experience greater amounts of hopelessness and despair. Anxiety and depression are more common in girls, adolescent females, and adult women, yet women are more likely to acknowledge a struggle and seek support. And I think those are just important facts that we want to arm boys with, particularly in adolescence, to understand, okay, these are the realities. No different than we have this great data on hand that we've now known for quite some time, that it's important to talk with adolescents about a history of substance abuse if that exists in your family, to let those kids know you are more vulnerable to addiction. So where a person over here could drink a beer and that's all they want, based on our family history, the likelihood of you doing that is not very great. And we don't help kids by keeping that information away from them, but by arming them. And I think this is kind of a similar philosophy of, let's just talk about these hard realities. That's not a scare tactic, but it's just this reality of we need to be informed and know these are some vulnerabilities that exist. We're going to have to work harder. And again, it goes all the way back to the front side of development. We've got fewer words. And if I were to lastly just build on that, I would say this. You spoke to it well a few minutes ago when you talked about the anger piece. Somewhere around 9 to 10, boys begin to channel all primary emotions, fear, anger, sadness, disappointment, into one emotion, and that one emotion is anger. So if I've got fewer words on the front side of development, and then at some point a little farther down the road in development, I'm going to start channeling everything toward anger, and then a little farther down the road, my tendency to shove things down and not ask for help is greater than it is for the females around me. We've got more work to do in this emotional space with the boys we love, which is part of why I'm so thankful you all would let me come talk about it.
I think as a listener, I'm thinking as a mom, that all feels overwhelming and scary. To even read those stats, I'm imagining you and your wife reading those stats to your twin sons. What did you say after that?
Yeah.
You know, parents are like, okay, I'm going to read those.
Yeah.
Now what? So you're susceptible to these things. Where's the hope?
Yeah. Here's the hope. First, I would say to any mom listening who's immediately going to a place of, I feel overwhelmed, I end every chapter of this book. I committed to my editor, I'm ending every chapter with 5 practical ways you can put these ideas into practice. Like, we're not waiting until the end of the book. Like, every chapter is going to end with 5 easy things that parents could be doing in the moment, on the ground, putting these principles into practice. So I don't want them to feel overwhelmed. And then the bigger hope for me is I have a great story in this book that I absolutely love about a single mom who had struggled with anxiety over the course of her life. And she said to her son, who was starting to show signs of that, she said, you know, buddy, I want to tell you that if you were to struggle with worry and anxiety like I have over the course of my life, I'm so thankful that we live in a time where we know what to do with that. I know a lot of great skills and strategies to teach you so that you can, this was her language and I love it, I'm borrowing it from this wise single mom, so that you can carry it with God throughout your life. And I loved that language because it communicated, if this goes on, and anxiety is not something that just magically goes away at your 18th or your 21st birthday, but if you struggle with this in different seasons ongoing, there's good skills and strategies that we know that you can implement in the day-to-day, and you will always be able to carry this with God. You're not alone. You need God every day, all day, and we need community. Some of the healthiest parents I have worked with in my 25 years of doing this work are parents in recovery. And I think they're some of the healthiest because they live under the principles of the 12 steps, which means I start every day by acknowledging I struggle and I need God and I need community. And wouldn't we all be better if we lived from that starting point every day? Like, those things are true for every one of us, whether addiction is part of our story or not. Like, we all need God. We all need community. We all need to wake up and start from a place of acknowledging I have a need.
Dave, you were talking about how you feel like you weren't very good at this. But as a mom, I've realized I parented often in fear. And so I called one of our sons who was away at school, and I had asked him an opinion on something. And he said, Mom, I'm processing some stuff and I just can't talk right now. And as a mom, I'm like, what do you mean you're processing stuff? What kind of things are you processing? And he said, it just feels like you are always trying to fix me. You're always afraid that I was going to fail or do something. Not fail because he's very driven, but fail in terms morally or drinking or partying. And he said, I just need to process some of the pain that I went through growing up of trying to be perfect for you. And I started crying because I realized even that moment I started defending myself. Well, hon, it's because I love you so much. It's because I see how amazing you are and blah, blah, blah. He said, but Mom, sometimes I just need to tell you that I'm struggling and you don't have to fix it. You don't have to fix me, Mom. And as a mom, we love our kids so much, and dads do too. We hate for them to be in pain. And so instead of letting him be in his pain, I'm trying to throw the life jacket on him and say, you're fine, for my own sake. And I wish that I would allowed him to be in his pain, to admit and talk about my own pain, and then not have to fix him. Is that normal for us to hate our kids to be in that pain?
Absolutely it is. I want to first say to you, what a gift that you could come to him in that kind of humility and listen and let him say all of what he needed to say. And
I wasn't very nice at first.
Of course. And it does bring about that instinct of, I want you to know what all was going on behind the scenes.
Yes.
And what was primarily going on is exactly what you're asking, is that there's not a parent alive who enjoys seeing their kids struggle in any way. Like it pulls on the deepest parts of who we are, and we want to take away the pain. And so I think everything about that makes sense to me. And I think even back to that story of that wise mom, like watching my kids in their own different ways learn to carry struggle with God has been one of the greatest challenges of my parenting, to step back and allow some of that to happen, to know that it is preparing them for their adult lives, to walk with God, to need God. You all, when we had lunch today, shared this beautiful story with me about one of your sons and the way you allowed something to happen in his life that you now can see the fruit of, how it deepened his faith and how it connected some dots for him. And I think for any parent listening, I would want to remind you of that as I'm reminding myself of that right now, that everything in me wants to fix and do and change and renovate. And I could put a whole list of words to that. And the ultimate goal is that I would equip my kids so that they can walk with God and carry their struggle and their children's struggle and their grandchildren's struggle with God when I'm no longer here at some point. Thinking even back to our friend Dan Allender, who talks about this relationship being transformative. It is the hardest thing I have ever done.
Yeah.
And the best thing I have ever done too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is hard and it is the best. And, we sort of thought, I think a lot of us parents think when they are raised and we send them off, we're done. And we're not. One of the things that I've found fascinating about this season, which is also very hard, is they come to you now as adult men or adult women, if you had daughters, and they speak out things that you did that hurt them or let them down or failed them. And that's hard to hear, but it's necessary for them to do that. I did the same with my parents. Now they're doing it with us, and we can do what Ann was saying and go, and instead we should just listen and realize, in your words, David, what's happening is they're naming and navigating as an adult man or woman now. And that's exactly what our job is as parents, is to equip them in such a way that they can do that, rather than cut them off because we're trying to save our self-esteem and say we did a good job, rather than going, yep, I'm sorry for that. And in some ways I'm watching you mature because of that. Is that true?
Absolutely. And I think it's even part of that desire that I think exists for every one of us as parents, that our kids would outperform us. Not just vocationally, but I want my kids to do a better job of parenting than I did. I want them to live out so many different parts of their lives differently that if we're really doing our job, that's always the great hope that we would get to see some evidence and fruit of that. And I, have already seen some evidence of that. I mean, my sons outperform me at 20 in some places. It's mind-blowing to me, and it excites me.
Yeah.
It excites me to think they're figuring some things out earlier than I did, and I'm grateful for that. I want that.
Yeah, we got on the plane just yesterday, flying back from spending a weekend with one of our sons and their kids, and Ann said to me, he is such a good husband and dad. And I know what she was really saying. He is a better man at that age than you were.
No, I'm not
it wasn't
saying...
a cut down at all, but that's what I saw. It's like he is better. I mean, like times 100 than I was at the same age. And that is not like I'm jealous. It's like, thank you, Jesus.
Yeah.
That's what we're called to do. That is a beautiful thing to see.
I remember as he dropped us off at the airport, we both laid our hands on him and prayed for him and just thank God for the things that we have seen in him. And it hasn't been easy and he's struggled, but to see him surrendering his life and his family to Jesus, that's what we all long for as parents. And you're right, Dave, I don't think it's ever too late to apologize to even, I remember saying to another son this past week, like, I'm really sorry that you were feeling so lonely in high school. That must have been really hard for you. And for me not to enter in, and I said, like, I don't know what I would have done, but I wish I would have done a better job at that. And that must have felt so lonely. And for him just to say it was really hard. And for me just to let it sit there.
It's so hard, isn't it?
Yes.
It's so hard. But I think what's happening in those moments, which is even in keeping with the conversation we're sharing about our kids doing better than we did, is, I think about those wise words of whatever we don't transform, we will inevitably transmit.
Yes.
And I think there is incredible truth to that. And so it's like, to even your earlier question, if I'm working to transform some things, if I'm working to try and do better than my grandfather could do, because I have more to work with. We know more at this point along the way. And then my hope is my boys can do better than I can too. Then I'm not just transmitting things. I'm working to try to name and navigate things differently than my grandfather knew to do. And my father was able to do better than him. And I hopefully have raised sons who'll know how to do it even better than I could. Yeah. And so I love the legacy of that, even as you're talking. And it does take a lot of, I think, to your great story, sitting and listening and figuring out how not to speak at times. And
I'm so bad at that.
I know. Aren't we all? And you know what I even talk about in the book to that? I think we are being trained against that in this world more than ever. Like, I think we're being trained. I think it's one of the worst parts of technology and social media in particular is that we're just invited to comment in real time all the time. Like everything somehow needs my opinion or my input in some way. And so I talk about how we're being trained against regulation. And I worry about that for kids of this generation who are growing up with that, believing that I somehow need to give input to that at all times, when the reality, all of us know, wisdom means sometimes I don't need to say a word. It means I just need to sit in that and listen, and there's nothing needed to contribute to it except silence and humility.
David, when you just said what isn't transformed is transmitted, I just want to say to the dad, and Ann could speak to the mom if you want.
I was going to say, and to the mom.
It's either one. If you're walking in some struggle, and we all are, I often thought, I got to get a grip on this for me. I never thought, I got to win this battle for my legacy. Here's what I know now. This isn't just about you. If you don't let God transform your pain or your struggle, it will be passed on. It's Exodus 20. The sins of the father will visit the third and fourth generation. At the same time, the righteous man will see his legacy blessed for 1,000 generations. So I just want to remind you, man, if you're listening, you're like, I'm going to deal with that tomorrow, or don't wait. You got to get help. You got to tell somebody, get a counselor, get a buddy, get it out of the dark into the light, and get God working in this area, because this isn't just about you. This is about your son going to deal with the same thing, or your daughter. I just want to encourage you as one man who's been there and still walking that road. Don't wait. Start the healthy healing process right now.
So we're eating one summer night. Our boys were 10, 8, and 5. And I wanted to get done with dinner so I could go mow the grass because I love mowing the grass.
Did you hear that, ladies? My wife loves to mow the grass. Guys would get all over me, but you let your wife.
I love doing it. But while our kids were eating, all the neighborhood boys would hang out at our house. So I go out to mow, and I'm kind of watching this group of 5 boys underneath the treehouse that you had built. And there's all this spare wood underneath. And so
very safe environment for boys.
I'm watching them as I'm mowing. I'm pushing this mower, and I can see that they're taking this wood and they're going 1, 2, 3, and then they would try to break this piece of wood across their foreheads.
Like a 2x4.
Yes.
2x6, I think.
Yes, they're cheering for each other. I'm like, what is happening right now? And they think they're laughing. They're all into this. And these boys range from maybe 12 to 8. And so I keep watching, and all of a sudden, this kid, Mike, he's 12 years old, and he takes this piece of wood and he tries to break it over his forehead. And all of a sudden, I see this blood just trickling down his face. So I turn off the mower and I said, guys, what are you doing? He goes, Mrs. Wilson, this is amazing. Are you seeing what Mike just did? I said, guys, he's bleeding. He's like, I know, but he was the best at it. And I said, Mike, you need to go home, and I want you to make sure. I could tell that it wasn't that bad, but it was bleeding. I said, make sure you tell your mom what you have been doing. And so they're like, yeah, do it, Mike, go tell your mom. And I just kept mowing thinking, this is the craziest thing. If you would have told me as a young mom that this is what these boys would be doing, I was like, are you crazy? What kind of a person, what kind of a child would try to do this? And it would be some boys.
Welcome to the world of raising boys.
Everything about the story is making sense to me.
Wait, is it really?
Yes. I remember the 3rd trip to the ER with one of my boys. I asked the triage nurse, can you get frequent flyer points like you do with an airlines here?
And David, we're talking about your book, Raising Emotionally Strong Boys. And you have twin boys, you have a daughter, but you really do specialize your therapy with boys. And why did you choose boys?
You know, it's interesting. I have been asked before why I even wanted to do this work.
Yeah.
And then specifically with boys. And if I were to think back over the trajectory of my own life, I think in a lot of ways, as I connect dots, I can see evidence of where I maybe always knew I was supposed to do this work. Like I remember being a kid in elementary school and sitting on the playground and people would tell me things and I would think, I don't know that you're telling your other friends these things. And I became a camp counselor when I was in college, and I seemed to always get tapped on the shoulder by my friends who had trouble getting the homesick kids to bed at night. They just wouldn't stop crying. They'd be like, hey, can you come help for a minute? You're kind of a kid whisperer in that way. And I would end up going on long hikes with groups of kids and walking beside the kid whose parents had just divorced. So it did feel natural to me to be in those spaces. I would end up on airplanes and people would kind of tell me their life story. And I think all that was God's preparing me in some ways to do the work that I do.
God made you to do this.
I believe He did.
I mean,
really
that's so
do.
beautiful to hear that. Even at lunch, I'm like, man, you are such a empathetic, caring, tender soul.
I want to pour my heart
thing.
out, don't you?
Yeah, and especially boys need that. It's almost the opposite of what our culture says. You know, boys are strong, they're tough, they don't need... It's the opposite.
Yeah.
Because we're strong and tough, and a lot of times that's a cover for pain and hurt in our life.
Yes,
they need somebody to help them grow emotionally strong, the title of your book. So today we thought we'd throw some questions at you.
And we might not...
We got a counselor in the office with us.
And we may not be able to get to all your questions, but you do have a podcast with Sissy Goff, who's been in our show before, who's amazing.
She's remarkable.
Share a little bit what you and Sissy do.
Well, she is something extraordinary in this world. Grateful that Sissy and I have been friends and worked together for over 25 years now. And we started this podcast years ago. We're in our 5th season at this point, where we wanted to take a lot of what we were learning, just sitting in our offices, being with kids and adolescents and families day in and day out, and bring that learning to that platform. And so we've been doing this for several years. We're learning all along the way and love having those conversations. My favorite thing that we do is what I'm having the great privilege to do with the two of you right now, which is just to have conversations with other folks. So we started third season in having guests on where we would just ask them questions about what they're learning from this unique journey of parenting. And so it's been a real gift. It's called Raising Boys and Girls. And we've got a season devoted to ages and stages of development, and one that is connected to a book that we co-authored called Are My Kids on Track, which is 4 emotional, social, and spiritual milestones that we want to see kids moving toward. Our current season right now is called Raising Emotionally Strong and Worry-Free Kids. It's based on her new book and mine. And so really, really grateful for that platform and the opportunity to get to have some rich conversations with folks.
It's so good. I know that Sissy Goff's book has helped my granddaughter, and it's so rich. And then our son, who has 4 kids, said, have you guys have David Thomas on? You're like, we want to, because we've all benefited so much from what you've written, David. So let's get into the questions.
So what are we going to ask?
Well, I have a couple things.
I mean, here's one. I'd start with what Ann said earlier. If you're a young mom or you have young kids, maybe you're an older mom or dad, and you really are trying to understand this boy thing about that physicality, like taking a piece of wood and banging it in your forehead, that makes no sense. It's like, and especially if you've maybe grown up with sisters or only raised daughters, you may think there's something wrong with the kid. Well, and there could be. But often it's just a boy.
I have had young moms come up to me and say, there's something wrong with my child. And I said, really? Like, I'll totally pray for you. What's happening? And she'll say, like, I'm an only child, and I have these 2 sons that are, barely 12 months apart, and all they do is hit, they punch, they run, they're loud, they're dirty, and there's something wrong with them. And I remember saying, I think, like, it never hurts to get help and to get a second opinion, but it kind of sounds like they're just boys. Is that what you would?
I love that you're saying that. I don't think we can say enough of that to moms. And I sit daily, weekly with moms who didn't grow up with brothers. So either only had sisters or were only children, who would say, this creature feels like a foreign entity to me. Like, I just don't understand so much about what's going on. And it's why the very first book I wrote on boys was a book called Wild Things, The Art of Nurturing Boys. And I just break down 5 stages of development, and I talk about what's going on in each stage and what he needs from the adults in his life. And I would say the greatest compliment I have ever received from writing that book is how many parents have come up to me at events or in the airport, different places, and just said, I had no idea he was this normal until I read that book. And I'm so thankful for that feedback, because I think particularly for moms, and especially, again, if you didn't grow up without any brothers, it feels anything but normal. And I think what instinctively will happen in those moments is that we can overparent or over-discipline or set unrealistic expectations out of, again, what we know and what's familiar. I mean, we're creatures of habit. We always will be falling back when we're not even aware it's happening on what we know and what's familiar. And if boys aren't familiar, if you didn't have brothers, then it makes sense to the story you started with that you would be thinking something's wrong.
Yeah.
As opposed to, it fascinates me, all the stories I hear from parents of things. Just think, I would never have operated that way in the world, but that made sense to him in that moment. And so I would say that could be a good starting point. You don't have to get my book, but just get some content that allows you to understand more about development, to keep from that tendency of overparenting, over-disciplining, or setting unrealistic expectations.
What are some tips that you would give parents with this physicality, especially in the winter? When you're living up north and it's
you
snowy
live in Nashville,
and cold,
you don't know about the winter.
They can't be outside, and so you feel like you're going crazy.
You would.
And we sometimes would literally take them out and say, we're running 100 yards, and I'd run with them just to get all that out. And you mentioned in your book about the space.
Yes.
Which I'd never heard that term before, so that's another way?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I would say both of the things you've just said, I want you to lean into. And figuring out how can I do that if the weather is not agreeable. And, we don't have the extremes that you all are describing in Nashville, but we have a lot of rain in the spring to where it's just challenging. And I remember going to the mall that's closest to our house, and I would just run them around the top of the mall, and I'd create a scavenger hunt out of the stores so that there would be this release. I say in Wild Things, in some ways, we've got to treat it identically to how we would imagine training a puppy that you come home and has been kenneled for a long period of time. Like, if you let that dog out and you don't go straight outside, he's going to pee on the floor and tear something apart, or both. And I think boys are a lot that way. Like, we've got to create enough outlets for release. It's why my wife and I laugh when our boys were little and we had to fly on a plane to see her parents out of state. Our running joke was, we don't board the plane unless everyone is sweaty. Like, we were running laps in the airport. Like, we would find some space where they could climb, run, move in a way, or else it was going to be a torturous 2 hours on that plane. And so I think there is wisdom. And to the concept of the space, I talk about it as an opportunity for a boy to release the physicality of his emotion. So he doesn't just have energy in terms of his personhood. He has a lot of energy and intensity in terms of his emotional experience. And so I recommend creating a space. This could be the corner of a rec room or a mud room or your garage, and fill that with tactile and movement-based objects. So, for example, when my sons were toddlers, we had a Bozo Bop It. I don't know if anybody remembers those.
Yes.
Inflatable with sand in the bottom, and you could pop it and it would bounce right back up. And when they would start to have big emotions, I would say, I can tell you're having big feelings. Let's go to the space. And they could punch that Bozo Bop It. Now, I know there is a mom listening right now that is saying in her head, or maybe out loud and hearing me say that, no, I don't want to train him to be a puncher or a hitter. And what I want you to hear me say, please hear me say, is that need for release is instinctive. It's part of how God hardwired him. So you aren't training him to be a hitter. You are creating healthy outward movement. And so with kids 12 and under, they are, in terms of their cognitive development, in what we call concrete thinking. So the world is very black and white. So what this would look like in the space would be, I could put an oversized pillow and I could say, you can punch a pillow, but you cannot punch your sister. You can scream at a pillow, but you cannot scream at mom. You can throw a pillow down, the pillow's not hurt, but you shove a person down and they are. Do you see the concrete opportunity I'm creating in that? Otherwise, the mistake I think we make with boys is saying things like this: stop being so angry. Quit shoving. Stop hitting. We're saying what not to do, but we're not saying what to do. So that would be the equivalent of me getting on the airplane, to that example I shared, without giving my boys a release and saying, quit squirming, sit down constantly. It's like, I didn't give him a release. Of course it's hard to sit still. I didn't give you a healthier option of how to move that anger, how to move that frustration, how to move that disappointment in a healthier direction.
And is there at some point where then you're trying to get them to tell you what they're feeling?
Yes.
When does that happen?
So all of it happens in the same experience, but I love that you asked that question, because here's what's key. I have a section in the new book that I call the ABCs of emotional development, and it's naming, breathing, which we can come back to, and coping. So coping would be a lot of those strategies that we put in the space. But I talk about, with boys, we often have to reverse that equation. So we got to do coping first, get the energy out, then some breathing to finish settling my brain and body, and then naming the feelings.
Okay, that makes way more sense.
It does. And I think we shove a feelings chart, which I'm a real advocate of a feelings chart.
Right.
I'll talk about it all through the book. But we do that when a boy's amped up with all that intensity and physicality, and then he yells, I don't know what I'm feeling. I'm just angry.
I've done that exact same. And that's what they do. They're so amped up, like, are you mad? Like, tell me what you're feeling. And they just think they're yelling at me like, I don't even care.
Yes. Which is why, using that story I told a little bit earlier with my boys when they were little, I can tell you're having big feelings, but notice I didn't get them to try and name them. Let's go to the space. The whole focus was just on releasing the intensity, which is really regulation. I talk a lot about that. In fact, if there were one theme in this new book, that would be one of the primary themes, is helping kids regulate their emotions, which is all the way back to, as we've been talking together over these rich conversations, naming and navigating. Regulation is the navigating part. It's figuring out the what to do with the emotions. And we got to start there often with boys, the release of the intensity or the physicality, and then we can get to the naming. So even there, when I talk about naming and navigating, often we're going to do the navigating first and the naming second. Because what's happening, if I were to just real briefly talk about what's going on in the brain, is that when any of us becomes emotionally charged, what happens is that blood flow moves from the front of our brain to the back, from our frontal lobes, which help us manage our emotions and think rationally, to the back of our brain, to the amygdala, that fight, flight, or freeze part. And we try to talk to kids when they're in fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah.
We even try to discipline kids often when they're in fight, flight, or freeze. And discipline is designed for teaching. It's not designed for punishment. And so if we want kids to make connections, to figure out, okay, I don't need to do this again because I'm going to get in trouble if I repeat this behavior. If their thinking brain is not even online, if they can't think rationally or manage their emotions, it's wasted breath. And then the other hurdle that comes into existence is often when our kids get amped up, we match that intensity and we get amped up. So then we've got two people who don't have their thinking brain online, who can't think rationally or manage their emotions, trying to have a thoughtful conversation together. That's a train wreck right there waiting to happen. It's why research has long told us, I think will always tell us, the two biggest mistakes we make in discipline as parents are too much talk and too much emotion. The two biggest mistakes we make in discipline as parents, too much talk and too much emotion. So think about it. We're going in to discipline in a dysregulated state and expecting a dysregulated person to make good connections about what they shouldn't do later. So the primary objective, back to what I talked about, needs to be coping first, breathing second, naming last. And the breathing part in the book, I call it combat breathing with boys. Sissy calls it square breathing in her office with girls, but I have to dress it up to get boys a little more bought in. And that is actually something I learned. I've done a lot of work with Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, and is a required skill they've told me they have to demonstrate. So think about it. These are folks who've got to be able to think rationally and manage their emotions. They are in life or death situations. So if they don't have skills and strategies in place that allow them to calm their brains and bodies, they can't save lives. They can't do the work they need to do. So combat breathing, something that lowers my heart rate, settles my brain and body, moves that blood flow from the back to the front, is a required skill. And I can get more boys and adolescent males bought in when they think, okay, if you're teaching me something Navy SEALs and Army Rangers have to do, I'm in.
So you've taken them to a place where they've gotten their emotions out. They're hitting something. They can yell, whatever. Now you're taking them to this breathing exercise.
Yes.
Walk us through, what's that look like?
So we teach it by having kids trace a square on their leg. And the tracing of the square is actually a grounding technique.
Yeah, Sissy
did this. I thought this is so good.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah.
And what it also does is it helps kids get the pace and rhythm of breathing, because there's a tendency when we're amped up to breathe too fast, which won't slow my heart rate down, which won't move that blood flow from the back to the front. In fact, I had a little 7-year-old boy came into my office for his first appointment, and he said, my mom listens to your podcast all the time, and she says you talk a lot about breathing. I want you to know I've tried it and it doesn't help me. And I said, well, that is really interesting, because everybody I teach it to says that it does help. Why don't you show me how you're doing it? And he went, I said, okay, really? That's labor and delivery breathing. You don't need that ever your whole life. So I'm going to teach you a different kind called combat breathing, which is much slower, and that drawing of the square helps get that slower down. So we're going to breathe in on one leg, breathe out on the second, breathe in on the third, breathe out on the fourth, and we're going to pause for 4 seconds in each. And so that drawing of the square is a grounding technique that automatically is going to do some settling. That slow, deep breathing. You all, I think it's amazing. I love teaching this to kids. At least 20 seconds of deep breathing will begin to reset the amygdala. Isn't it amazing God made our bodies in that way, that something as simple as breathing could start to slow down my heart rate? I wear the Apple Watch, and I'll have kids in my office watch it. All right, I want you to look at my heart rate right now. Do you think it's going to go up or go down when you and I breathe together? And kids always know it's going to go down. And so at least 20 seconds will begin the reset. If I double that to 40, twice the benefit. If I triple it to 60 seconds, 1 minute of deep breathing will do a lot of work in terms of settling. So that coping, breathing, then I can do the naming part.
What's that look like?
So I think that's when we do introduce the feelings chart. And anybody listening, if you don't have one on hand, I would strongly recommend you do. And I want you to do it for 2 reasons. And you can download one off our website. We've got them on our website, raisingboysandgirls.com. You can get one there. But the purpose there is this, any of you listening who have kindergartners or first graders, think about how your kid's classroom, I know anyone listening, whatever city, whatever state, somewhere in that space are the letters of the alphabet. Why do we have the letters of the alphabet up in those early learning spaces? Because we know as kids are learning letters, when they can see the letters, it strengthens the connection. Using a feelings chart is the same way. If I'm pointing to the expression, naming the feeling, even for kids who can't even read, it's going to strengthen that connection. The second reason I'd recommend families have a feelings chart around is that I think it is a great prompt for us as adults just to remember to fold in more emotional vocabulary into our daily lives. Like, I'm going to challenge any parent listening when you are sitting around the dinner table and we're asking each other those common questions like, hey, how was your day? I don't want anyone listening going forward to say, it was fine.
Not allowed.
Not allowed. FINE is an acronym for feelings in need of expression. That's what FINE is. And so
say that again. That's good.
Feelings in need of expression. That's what FINE is. And I want you to replace that with, you know what? I felt embarrassed today. I had to give a presentation to the board of directors and I didn't feel prepared. I felt sad today. I think I said something that hurt a friend or a coworker's feelings and I want to circle back and check in on them. I want kids to get to hear that kind of reporting.
And from parents.
From the grown-ups they trust the most in this world. And could I throw in one more story real quick?
Yeah.
You all are so kind of let me keep on going. But if I were to think back to the earlier question you asked, just thinking about moms of young kids listening, to that point, I want to challenge, and this is true for moms and dads, I want you to think about narrating your experience, that's what I call it in the book, as often as possible. Now, obviously in an age-appropriate way. But part of going back to how men were socialized, we were taught that you don't name experiences and therefore kids won't be affected by it. So a lot of adults grew up with alcoholics in their family and no one talked about this person who drank too much, raged, sometimes threw things, and then we all pretended like it wasn't happening. We were all experiencing something when that happened, but no one gave it a name. We know now we should have named those experiences. So when we narrate our experiences in age-appropriate ways, it helps kids build emotional strength. So if, we had a great tragedy in our city of Nashville recently with the Nashville shooting, and my kids are away at college and they all called home struggling with it in their own ways because they knew folks connected. The head of school was a dear friend of ours who I love. And I was, even with my 20-something-year-olds, narrating my experience of just saying, we went to Catherine's service today. I just wept because I miss her so much. I can't believe this has happened. And here's what I'm doing to figure out how to take steps forward. And do you see how that's naming and navigating with kids? That's what narrating our experience could look like. I had a dad of an 8-year-old daughter who told me that his daughter came home one Wednesday night from church and she had learned this song at church about worry. And he was driving to work the next day and he got a text he saw at a stoplight that was some big hurdles he was going to be walking into at work. And this man owns his own company. And he said, I could feel my heart rate increasing in the car. And I looked in the rearview mirror at this little girl I love and thought about her teaching us the song about worry last night. And I said, sweetheart, will you teach me that song about worry one more time? Because I think I'm going to need that today. And his very intuitive 8-year-old daughter said, what are you worried about, Dad? And he said, you remember during COVID how I shared with you that I can't get all the products I need for my company so I can get the things I want to make for my customers? I think it's happening again and I feel worried about that. And so she taught him the song again. She got out of the car and he said, I love you. And she walked back up to the window and she said, Dad, I'm going to pray for you today about your work worries. And I want you to sing that song back to yourself 3 times. Isn't that incredible?
It makes me cry. It's the best. I can't imagine if my dad had done that and showed that vulnerability and emotion as a child. I'm drawn to that. And it's a modeling The modeling piece is like, now I know how to deal with my emotions when they're really strong or hurting or when I'm worried. That's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful? And it's such a picture of naming and navigating. Like, this is what it looks like to feel worry as a grown-up, which we all will. That's normal. And what you taught me last night is going to help me navigate it. So teach me that song again so I can do that back today. So it could be as simple as that. And I want any parent listening to hear me saying, my guess is that whole conversation between that dad and daughter lasted about 3 minutes. So I'm not assigning you extra work. I want you to use what's right in front of you. I want you to just have these conversations at the dinner table, but knowing that this is landing on the kids we love. And when they can sit front row to the grown-ups they trust the most in this world, naming and navigating, it's the best tool for helping them build emotional strength.
Oh, we're going to start that.
Yeah, and I would
Let's start that, Dave, me and you.
What part?
All of that, naming and navigating.
Well, here's
this
what I was
so
thinking.
Good.
Here's my encouragement to the dad and mom. As I listen to you, David, it's like everything you said, and even as I read your book about how to raise emotionally strong boys, I thought, wow, this isn't for the boys as much as it is for me as a dad and for moms. But even listening to Ann talk about her dad, who I knew well and loved, he became my dad. He was my high school coach. He never knew how to process emotions. He grew up in that generation.
Right.
You weren't even supposed to. It's like you're weak if you admit that. But here's the beauty. His daughter's doing it.
Yes.
His son-in-law is doing it.
Yes.
And so often we think, I didn't get it, so I can't pass it on. Guess what? You can change the legacy with knowledge and understanding and humbleness to say, God, please change me so that I can pass this on to my kids. That's hopeful. But as you think of signs we should be looking for that say, man, this is unhealthy. The emotional health in this home is not good. What's the first one that comes to your mind?
Well, I like this plan because I want to hear from the two of you in terms of your observations as well. But I would say if I were going to throw out the top 3, I'm going to cheat a little from leaning into 3 things I talk about in the book that were rooted in the very question you're asking of seeing evidence of what would cause kids to move in a direction of not developing emotional strength. And so I talk in the book about what I call the 3 R's, which I'll name them, and then we'll talk about where they fit within your questions. So it's recognize, regulate, and repair. And recognize, if I were just going to give a quick definition to each, recognize is kind of like the dashboard on a car where it will signal us, your dashboard's going to signal you if your tire is low or the tank is empty, or you might get a check engine light that means I've got some bigger problems potentially.
It actually means nothing, David. It's just a light, It's like, what are you talking about? It's got to be wrong.
And we could even talk about the male's response to the check engine light versus the female's, which fits within all of what we've been discussing.
I've never thought of that in my life. If the light is on, it needs to be serviced now.
Exactly. And how that fits, I think, with all of what we've been talking about along the way.
Yeah.
And that, we are less likely as males to pay attention to some of those signs and signals. And I talk about how the dashboard on the car is the same as our bodies, and that our bodies will signal us when we are carrying more stress than we need to be carrying for extended periods of time. And how I think for every one of us as people, if I carry high levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, that's even going to show up. That may show up in some ways like headaches or migraines or digestive issues, or I carry a lot of tension in my back and neck. My body is going to cue me in the way my car will cue me. And if I pay attention to those signs and signals and do what the car needs, the car keeps running. If I ignore those, I'm going to end up on the side of the road, and it turns out the same is true. Think about the classic work, the body keeps the score. It turns out that's 100% true. Our bodies do keep score. And so I would say the first benchmark of an unhealthy home would be you don't pay attention to what you're feeling or what the people who are around you are feeling. We dismiss, we disconnect. There are all different directions that I think we move. And I think even back to our earlier conversations, that happened for generations and generations. We didn't name the hard things that were happening in families, believing if we don't talk about it, it's not really happening, when in reality, it made it worse because we didn't give it a name. And what we know happens with kids in those moments is that if no one names what's going on, kids internalize that and often move toward a sense of responsibility, which is why often in the case of addiction, for example, kids will work hard when no one names the problem of addiction to believe I need to be fill in the blank, a better student, more compliant, less loud, all the directions that kids go to try and keep a parent who's medicating with a substance from taking hold of the substance. And I've even known kids who set alarms in the middle of the night and would go into the refrigerator and dump out alcohol, believing that would stop it. You see that sense of responsibility because we aren't naming what's going on, which starts with that first R of recognizing. So I would say the second would be...
Let's stay right there.
We'll stop there. We'll camp out there.
I'm thinking, Dave, of you.
No, do we have to go back to me?
No, I think this is significant. I'm thinking back when you were 7 and your little brother died, who was 5.5, so you're a year and a half apart, and he died around Halloween. And I remember your mom, and let's just say this, your family never talked about it.
Oh, never.
Never talked about it. You just ignored everything. And because your family, like your mom and dad, were both alcoholics, you never talked about anything. But I remember your mom saying every single Halloween after Craig died, you got sick. You know, it's like
literally.
Physically
there it is.
Got
sick. But instead of recognizing that and thinking, we should probably get help, nothing was ever done.
Yeah, and that was my question when you were saying unhealthy homes don't recognize. How do you recognize what you can't recognize? Like when I heard that study in seminary, I thought I'm good. I couldn't even see it, yet I had, and everybody else with any kind of insight would have been able to go, dude, can you see it? And I'm going to think one of your answers may be what helped me is my wife was able to speak into me. Other men would say, hey, dude, and you have to listen and go, really? Is that part of the answer?
Absolutely, it is.
Somebody else, I know you write about mentors and friends and mom and dad in your book, but it's other people helping you?
One of the questions I ask early in the book is, who are your 5 people you go to ask for support? And I think there's 2 layers to that. 1, I need to know my 5 people, and 2, I need to know how to ask for help. It's one thing if I have people available to me, but I don't know how to be transparent and honest and say, what a powerful story you shared. Your body remembered what no one was naming.
Yeah.
And you know, it's important to go back to, I love what you said in an earlier episode of, you know, all we knew was what we knew at that point. And so I don't want any grandparent listening to feel shame as you hear us tell that story. We believe that we were helping kids when we didn't acknowledge those things, when in reality, it was hurting that we weren't naming the hard things happening around us. And so I think it really does start with the understanding of how vital that is, and that kind of back to what we talked about earlier, that internal pain always has an external presentation. And so I think even to your question a few minutes ago, I'm fascinated by how much we talked a little bit earlier about overachieving happens as a way of covering. And how many men I see in this world who are just knocking it out of the park vocationally that I think is a running from or racing away from some pain.
That was what a counselor said to Dave. Like, oh, wait, you're the quarterback, the point guard, the shortstop. You've won every award. You've played college football. You had a scholarship. And didn't he say, what are you running from?
No, we don't need to go there, but he literally was looking at my life now and saying, you know, every job you have, the spotlight is on you, whether it's on a stage or leading Bible study or even, he goes, go home and answer this question, what are you running from? And I laughed, like, what am I running from? I came home and Ann goes, oh my goodness, I've been saying that for 20 years. So it was that not recognizing. Okay, so that's one sign.
Let's
we got to keep going.
I know, but maybe we should even talk about take an assessment. You know, like ask your kids, think through, like, how are they doing physically? Are they saying their stomachs are upset, or they have headaches? Are they clenching their teeth so bad they break their teeth, like I've done several times? Maybe I should take an assessment. Okay, that's the first one.
Well, and I know to your great point that you all likely talk with my dear friend Sissy Goff about that. That's so often how we identify anxiety early on with kids is they're having tummy aches. That's one of the first ways that we can usually see an indicator light going off of some kind to that first star of recognize. Is that their body is presenting the worry in some way that they can't name.
That's good.
So the first sign is don't recognize. Second one is regulate.
Yes.
They don't. An unhealthy family would not regulate.
Exactly. So back to even the anger that we've talked some about, like it's so present. It's either under the surface boiling at all times, or it's flying all around the room, or it's showing up back to the internal, external through, let's say, substance abuse, or maybe it is a dad who is, using internet pornography as a way to try to manage and tame the anger in some way. So they haven't learned healthy coping skills. That's kind of my definition for regulate, is employing calming and coping strategies when the nervous system goes into a heightened state of arousal. So I have these signs and signals going off, and I've got to figure out, what do I need to employ to bring myself from stress to settled, or from chaos to calm? Where that even connects back to kids taking responsibility is that when parents are dysregulated, kids can pick up on what their parents are carrying and take responsibility, particularly when they're dysregulated. And believing, even if they never say it out loud, that it is in some way their job to help the grown-ups around them feel less, fill in the blank, stress, anger, sadness. In fact, you all, since the Nashville shooting happened, I have never had so many kids in my office talk about how their parents are doing than any other time in 25 years of doing this work. They're so attuned and aware, because understandably every parent, whether you had a child in that school or just a child in another school in Nashville, parents in our city are carrying more fear, more worry right now than any other time, because it's not just a story on the news somewhere else in the world. It happened in our city, in a school that we all know and love. And so I've had more kids say, my mom feels really worried. My mom is not usually this sad. I had a little boy even say to me, my dad never sleeps past 8 o'clock, but he has been sleeping past 8 a lot lately, which makes me think he's not sleeping much in the middle of the night. All the ways that I think kids have their thumb on the pulse of a family in ways we don't give them credit for. So when parents don't know how to do the work of regulation, I think, one, kids don't get an opportunity to sit front row and see what regulation looks like on the grown-ups they trust the most in this world. And two, they can start to take on some responsibility around that in ways that's not theirs to carry.
So how would we recognize that in our kids if they are taking on that responsibility? Because I'm guessing you're busy as parents. You've got a lot of demands on your life with work and school and activities. So how would they start looking to see if their kids are doing that?
I would first look for some of the physical signs. Are they reporting more tummy aches? Are they reporting more headaches? Are they having difficulty with sleep? Or kind of the other extreme, are they overachieving? Are they overperforming? Even kids who I feel like when their parents are really sad will over-entertain. Like I had a parent tell me one time they had lost a child and they noticed their firstborn child trying to be extra funny. It was almost like, I need to lift the heaviness by becoming a little bit of a comedian at the dinner table, by making sure I make my parents laugh enough during the day. So I would watch for some of those indicator lights of where kids might be carrying more, because we talk a lot in my work about how all behavior is communication of some kind. So even things that kids can't say or don't say, often we will see evidence of what's being said through their behavior in some way.
That's
and those
good.
would be some things to watch for.
Wow. We've only got 2 down so far. And
I
I'm
know.
like,
Those are so good.
I feel like there's so much to work on. So the third R.
The third R is repair, and that is taking ownership and doing any needed relational work. And I would say the sign of an unhealthy home is when you can't take ownership, you can't clean up your side of the street, you can't do the work of apologizing. That's something that I have heard both of you talk about doing with your adult sons at different points, which I think is a necessary ingredient for all families, because we are going to fumble the ball. There's only one perfect parent who has ever lived, and the rest of us are going to make mistakes. We're going to lose our temper. We are not going to be present with our kids in the ways we want. We're not going to show up as to all of who we want to be. And in those moments, we need to learn what it looks like to ask our kids for forgiveness if we expect them to be people in relationship with their own kids who know how to do that.
Those are good.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking, I thought, I got a fourth one, and it starts with the letter R. But as you said repair, I'm like, oh, it's the same thing. I was going to say refusal to repent. But it's really what you just said. It's an unhealthy home or an unhealthy person doesn't apologize, doesn't own their sin, doesn't own their mistakes. There's too much pride for them to ever go to their sons or daughters or their wife or their husband and say, I was wrong. So that's really what you're talking about in repair. It's just this repent humility that says, I need to do this. Probably, is it like something weekly, daily? It all depends, I guess, but it's regular.
It's regular.
It's another R, I guess.
It is. And I think it's worth building on because I think it is of such importance. And I talk about how boys do a lot of swinging between blame and shame as opposed to getting to that healthy middle ground of ownership. And so blame, think about all the different ways this could show up with boys. Blame could look like my teacher didn't teach it the right way. My sister made me mad. My coach didn't give me enough playing time, pointing the finger outward. In fact, I'll back up one step and say this. Research tells us that in the face of failure, boys are more likely to point the finger outward and blame someone else. Girls are more likely to blame themselves.
Wow.
And
I see
that's a male-female difference.
That is. And I see evidence of that, not just with kids, but with adults. I can't tell you how often I sit with moms in my office whose kids are struggling in some way who will say, tell me what I'm doing wrong.
Absolutely.
It's this assumption that if my kids are struggling in any way, it must be something I'm either doing or not doing enough of, where it just may be your kids are needing to do more skill development and it's not something you haven't done or not doing enough of. There just needs to be more practice. But I think that instinct can stay in place. And I think for adult men as well. I tell a story in the book of a dad whose son caught him in infidelity. He saw a picture on his dad's phone of his dad kissing another woman, and he asked his dad about it. And listen to the blame within his dad's response. It's so subtle, but it's important. He said, I wish you hadn't found that. You hear that?
Yeah.
Not, I wish I hadn't done that.
Yeah.
I wish you hadn't found that picture, And so I think that tendency can carry on throughout growth and development unless we're developing that third R, and where I think it is impossible for kids to develop any of those three R's unless they can see it, again, on the grown-ups around them. So where I think kids have to see repentance modeled in order to know how to do that and to believe how foundational it is to all their relationships.
All right, you got one?
Yeah.
Talk about the 5 signs of an unhealthy
I don't have any
emotional
R's.
home.
You can do any letter.
But I was
we can turn it into an R.
I was thinking about this. I come from a very performance-oriented family. Everything was competitive. We're the best. We have to be the best at everything. So I carry that into my parenting. And I didn't even know that I was doing it when our kids were really little, but I would compare them to other kids. And I would say things to them out loud. It's on video. And now they all watch it like, Mom, how can you do this? I remember one of our sons was trying to dribble. And what do I say? Your cousin Chaz can already dribble. Who says that as a parent? And I already carry that myself. I'm comparing myself because that's just what we did as a family. And so, but not only comparing our kids, I think we are in a culture right now where we're comparing ourselves to so many people that are invisible, even on social media. And so often we come up short. And so I don't think I compare my kids to other kids outwardly, but I can still do that inwardly of thinking, why aren't my kids progressing? Why aren't my kids acting like these other kids? It must be me. I always turn it inward. I don't as much as I used to, but it still can be that tendency where it feels to me sometimes like Satan whispers in my ear, it must be you. And God's just doing a work in all of us. So I think an unhealthy family is in constant comparison with their kids, themselves, the culture, and that healthy side. And I feel like we've learned to do that later in life, was we're seeing the beauty and the uniqueness of each one of our kids, and then we're speaking that to them. And if they're not measuring up to anyone else, it doesn't matter, because we don't want them to be anyone other than who God created them to be.
Oh, it not only makes sense, it's brilliant. I think
I love you. He's so nice.
Well, I think how often I'm saying to myself, like, the wisdom of those words we all know. Comparison is the thief of joy. Comparison is the thief of joy. Like, I can feel myself getting more discontent, more sad, more all these things the longer I camp out in that space. And that I love that you mentioned social media, because I think we talk all the time with kids and adolescents about, remember that it's just a highlight reel. It's just a highlight reel. And we can lose that ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, we are needing to say to ourselves out loud, whatever I'm seeing is about 10% of what's going on.
Yes.
That's it. And yet we forget, and then we slide right into that place of comparison. So I'm glad you mentioned it.
It just destroys. It's a tool of the enemy, because God's celebrating the uniqueness and the beauty of each of us all the time. Even as parents, when we fail, He's still cheering us on. It's the gospel. It's grace that covers a multitude of sin. It's the goodness of Jesus giving us new life. What's yours, Dave? What's the fifth one?
I mean, I thought I had this incredible insight, and then I realized David had already said it in repair. But here's one that we have mentioned that I think is definitely a sign of an unhealthy home. And when you do the opposite, it's a sign of a healthy home. And you've mentioned it already. I don't know what to say. It would be, if you want to use an R word, it would be release, say out loud what you're feeling, what you're hiding, maybe the pain you've gone through. And Ann mentioned it earlier. I grew up in a home where there's physical abuse, there is emotional abuse. Dad had girlfriends, left mom, both parents drank, and then my brother dies, all in a period of about 18 months. And we move. You know, I'm a little boy, and we move from my home of origin to a whole nother state just because that's where my mom's parents were. Now she's a single mom in the 60s. Again, all that to say, the day my brother dies, my sister told me, she's in high school. She said, I came home from high school. A priest is walking out of our driveway and says to me, your brother's dead. And he leaves. And Pam said, my sister, she said, I walk in the house. Mom never mentioned it. We never talked about it. And that's the home I grew up in. And so I thought it was normal. When you have pain, you stuff it away and you move on. And that's how we dealt with it. When my dad came to visit Ann and I in our first year of marriage, this is funny. It's tragic, but it's funny. He sits down after dinner, and Ann says to him, because she comes from a different home and a different, more healthy environment, she says, hey, Ralph, never heard your side of the divorce. Let's talk about, I'd like to hear your, and I grab her under the table. Like, what are you doing?
He's squeezing my leg.
I'm grabbing her like, you can't do that. We don't talk about that stuff. I was freaking out. I mean, our heart rate went over 100. I'm sure. I'm like, and I'm like, my dad is going to be so mad. He is going to look at her and just, and I'll never forget, my dad looks and goes, you want to hear my side? Nobody's ever asked me. And we have this conversation, and I'm sitting there going, I knew none of this. And again, I was being exposed to healthy families talk. So I would say, David, you know better than anybody. This is what you do for a living. Unhealthy families don't talk. They hide, they stuff, they push down, they overachieve, they cope, but they don't talk. Healthy families talk. True?
So true. And can I say two things to that I'm so struck by as I hear you tell that story? One, I'm so struck by to hear you name all of those ingredients that were a part of the earliest chapters of your life, and to think about who you are and what you do. Like, what a beautiful picture of what the enemy intended for harm, God intended for good.
Yeah.
That this should not have been your story.
Right.
And the redemptive rescue. I mean, that's extraordinary to think about who you are as a man and the work you are doing in this world. That's just incredible. And to hear you tell that story, that God would call you into relationship with this remarkable woman, who that would be her instinct to ask that question in the earliest moments, to think all the healing that would come through that relationship too. Like, I am so struck by the kindness of God when I sit with people and their stories, and when I sit in my own story, like just There is no other explanation.
Yeah.
No other explanation but the kindness and the goodness and the faithfulness of God. I just feel it so strongly as you were sharing that, and I just wanted to reflect that back to you.
No, and I would just add, when you say that, I think there's some listening that think that's your story. It can never be my story. Yes, it can. Because even David, when you say that, you know what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, but God, this does not happen. But while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And then we receive that and we repent. We've already used that word, and we say, I can't do this on my own. Jesus, I'm surrendering my life to you. He meets you there, and he turns these tragic stories into something. It isn't just that he meets us in our pain. He then says, I want to transform your pain, and then I want to use you to meet others in their pain.
And I would add, if you haven't talked to God lately, I would just encourage you, just tell him the things that you've struggled with, the pain that you're feeling, the feelings that you're having about your family or your kids. Tell him everything, because he cares about you. He loves you. He loves your kids. And he wants to make a difference in your life. He's right there. Just talk to him. This is so good, David. Thank you. It's been so helpful.
Thank you for having me. You two are a delight to talk with. You know that?
He's the nicest. I want to be your neighbor.
And I want to say to you both also, you are doing such life-giving work in this world. It is a genuine pleasure to get to be with the two of you, but I'm so grateful for what you are doing in this world and how I think it's impacting families. So thank you.
Yeah, we feel the same. Hey, thanks for watching. And if you like this episode,
You better like it.
just hit that like button.
And we'd like you to subscribe. So all you got to do is go down and hit the subscribe. I can't say the word subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. I don't think I can say this word.
Like and subscribe.
Look at that. You say it so easy. Subscribe. There it goes.